The bitter Montana wind cut through Pine Valley like a knife, and just as sharp were the whispers that followed Elena Sokolov as she stepped off the train with nothing but a small trunk and letters of promise. Letters from a man who wasn't even there to greet her. They said foreign brides don't last a winter in these mountains. They said Thomas Mitchell would send her back before the first snow. What they didn't know was that some hearts are forged in countries far colder than this one, and some promises, once made, refuse to be broken. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Pine Valley, Montana Territory, 1890. The kind of place where land stretches farther than dreams, and men measure worth by cattle counts and acres fenced. The Whispering Pines Ranch stood proudly amid rolling hills and evergreens. 2,000 acres, 500 head of cattle, 12 ranch hands, and one man whose life was about to change in ways he never imagined. Thomas Mitchell hadn't always called America home. 15 years earlier, he'd stepped off a ship from Ireland, a skinny boy of 12, with nothing but determination and his father's pocket watch. His uncle Harold had reluctantly taken him in, teaching him ranching with harsh words and harder expectations. Now at 27, Thomas had earned his place, working the land until his hands bled and his back ached, proving himself worthy of the Mitchell name. Harold Mitchell's study was unnervingly quiet as Thomas entered, hat in hand, his boots still, dusty from the morning ride. Mounted animal heads stared down from every wall, trophies of Harold's various conquests. The old man sat behind his massive oak desk, weathered fingers drumming impatiently on a stack of papers. "The mail order bride arrives tomorrow," Harold said without preamble, his voice graveled from years of barking orders and too much whiskey. Thomas stiffened. The arrangement had been Harold's idea, his demand, really. The Mitchell ranch needed heirs, he'd insisted, and Thomas needed a wife. When Thomas had shown no interest in the local girls, Harold had taken matters into his own hands. "Did you hear me, boy?" Harold's voice sharpened. "Yes, sir. Tomorrow." Thomas kept his face carefully neutral. Russian, wasn't she? Some place called Petrograd. Name's Elena Sokolov, according to the papers. Harold pushed a worn envelope across the desk. "She's paid for and contracted. Your job is to meet her, marry her, and get sons on her. Simple as that." Thomas took the envelope, fighting to keep his hand steady. "And if she's not suitable?" Harold's lips thinned. "She has 2 working hands and speaks enough English. That's all that matters for breeding stock." Thomas felt his jaw tighten, but said nothing. 15 years had taught him when to fight and when to swallow his pride. This wasn't his battle, not yet. "I'll send Patrick to fetch her from the station," Harold continued. "The preacher's ready day after tomorrow. No need for fancy preparations." Thomas nodded once, turned, and walked out without another word, the envelope heavy in his pocket like a stone. The bunkhouse was quiet when Thomas entered, most of the hands still out working the north pasture. He sat heavily on his narrow bed, finally opening the envelope. Inside was a daguerreotype and a single sheet of paper covered in careful, slanted handwriting. The woman in the picture wasn't what he expected. No smile, no attempt at artifice, just clear eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. She wasn't conventionally pretty by American standards, her features too sharp, her gaze too direct, but there was something arresting about her face. She looked, Thomas thought, like someone who had seen hard times and faced them standing tall. Her letter was brief, practical. She wrote of being 22, educated but practical, capable with household duties, interested in learning ranching ways. No flowery promises of devotion, no desperate pleas, just a straightforward exchange, marriage for opportunity. Her final line, however, caught him by surprise. "I do not fear hard work or loneliness, Mr. Mitchell. I only ask for honesty between us." Thomas carefully folded the letter and slipped it back into his pocket. Honesty, the one thing he hadn't considered in this arrangement. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he stood on the porch, watching the distant pinpricks of stars, wondering what kind of woman would travel across the world to marry a stranger, and what kind of man he was to accept it. Morning came too quickly. Thomas dressed with unusual care, choosing his newest shirt and polishing his boots until they gleamed. He decided against sending Patrick to the station. If he was to marry this woman, the least he could do was meet her himself. Willow Creek's train station was little more than a platform with a small shelter, but today it hummed with unusual energy. News traveled fast in small towns, and the arrival of a foreign bride was the most interesting thing to happen since last year's cattle stampede. Thomas recognized the cluster of town women near the platform edge. Abigail Peterson at the center, no doubt ready to gather every detail for dissection later at the general store. The train arrived in a cloud of steam and screeching metal. Thomas stood back, hat in hand, as passengers disembarked. First a traveling salesman, then an elderly couple, and finally a slim figure in a dark blue traveling dress. Elena Sokolov stepped onto the platform like someone entering unknown territory, cautious but determined, her eyes taking in everything at once. She was taller than he expected, her posture almost rigid. Her chestnut hair was pulled back severely, emphasizing high cheekbones and a straight nose. She carried a single trunk and a small leather bag, her knuckles white around the handles. Their eyes met across the platform. No smile, no nod, just mutual assessment. Thomas moved forward at the same moment she spotted him, recognition flashing in her eyes. "Miss Sokolov," he said, stopping before her and offering a slight bow. "Thomas Mitchell, welcome to Montana." Her eyes, a surprising shade of amber, studied him carefully. "Mr. Mitchell," she replied, her accent thick, but her English clear. "Thank you for meeting me." Thomas reached for her trunk. "Let me help you with—" "I manage," she said quickly, then seemed to reconsider. "But thank you." He noticed the whispers then, the barely concealed glances from Abigail's circle. Elena noticed them too, her chin lifting slightly, as if bracing against a cold wind. "Folks here are just curious," Thomas explained as he led her toward his wagon. "We don't get many visitors from—" "I am not visitor," she interrupted, those amber eyes meeting his directly. "I am here to stay." Something in her tone, determined, almost defiant, made Thomas pause. This wasn't a woman looking for rescue or charity. This was someone who had made a calculation and committed to it, whatever the cost. The ride to Whispering Pines was mostly silent. Elena sat straight-backed beside him, taking in the landscape with careful attention. Only once did she speak, when the ranch first came into view, spread across the valley floor. "It is beautiful land," she said quietly. Thomas glanced at her, surprised. "It can be harsh. Winters are brutal here." "In Russia, we know about winter," she replied, the ghost of a smile touching her lips for the first time. The ranch house loomed ahead, and Thomas felt a sudden unease. He hadn't told Harold he was meeting Elena himself, and his uncle would not appreciate the surprise. As expected, Harold was waiting on the porch, his imposing figure silhouetted against the afternoon light. Thomas helped Elena down from the wagon, conscious of how small her hand felt in his, despite its obvious strength. "So this is the Russian," Harold said by way of greeting, his eyes cold as they assessed Elena from head to toe. "Skinnier than I expected." Thomas felt Elena stiffen beside him, but was surprised when she stepped forward, offering a perfect formal bow. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice steady. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I am Elena Sokolov, Thank you for arranging my passage, Harold grunted, clearly thrown by her composure. You'll be staying in the south room until the wedding. Martha's left some things there for you. Thomas will show you. Elena nodded, once retrieved her trunk before Thomas could offer again, and followed him into the house. The south room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, and small window overlooking the distant mountains. Martha Wilson, the kind-hearted shopkeeper from town, had indeed left some essentials: a pitcher of water, clean towels, a bar of soap. It's not much, Thomas said awkwardly, standing in the doorway. It is more than I had in Petrograd, Elena replied simply. She set down her trunk and turned to face him fully. When do we marry? Her directness startled him. Day after tomorrow. The preacher's coming here. She nodded as if confirming a business arrangement. And your expectations of me. It is better to speak plainly now. Thomas felt heat rise to his face. We can discuss that after the ceremony. Elena studied him for a long moment. In your letters, you said you wanted partnership. Is this still true? Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Those weren't my letters, Miss Sokolov. My uncle arranged everything. Something flickered in her eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, or resignation. I see. Then tomorrow we begin again, with truth between us. She turned away then, a clear dismissal. Thomas left, closing the door quietly behind him, feeling as though he'd already failed at something important. Dinner that evening was a tense affair. Harold dominated the conversation, explaining ranch operations as if Elena were a slow child rather than an educated woman. For her part, Elena ate silently, back straight, occasionally nodding to show she was listening. You'll need to learn American cooking, Harold declared, pushing away his plate. And none of that foreign gibberish in this house, English only. My English will improve with practice, Elena replied evenly. See that it does. And tomorrow, you'll need proper clothes. Can't have you looking like some immigrant fresh off the boat. Thomas saw Elena's knuckles whiten around her fork, but her expression remained unchanged. I am immigrant, Mr. Mitchell. This is not something to hide. Harold's eyes narrowed. You're to be a Mitchell wife. That means looking and acting like one. I will be good wife, Elena said carefully, but I remain who I am. The silence that followed was heavy as storm clouds. Thomas cleared his throat. Elena's had a long journey. Perhaps we should let her rest. Harold stood abruptly. Fine. Show her how we do things in the morning. Might as well see if she's worth the trouble before the preacher arrives. After he stomped out, Thomas turned to Elena. I apologize for my uncle. He's set in his ways. Elena's gaze was steady. You do not need to apologize for him. A man must answer for his own words. She rose gracefully from the table. Good night, Mr. Mitchell. Thomas watched her leave, struck by the odd feeling that despite everything, the arrangement, the journey, Harold's rudeness, Elena Sokolov was somehow the most composed person in the house. Morning brought a sharp autumn chill. Thomas rose early, as was his habit, surprised to find Elena already in the kitchen, dressed in a simple blue skirt and white blouse, her hair braided and pinned neatly. She was examining the cast-iron stove with focused interest. Good morning, he said, hesitating at the doorway. She turned, nodding briefly. Good morning. This stove is different from what I know. Will you show me how it works? There was no embarrassment in her request, just practical efficiency. Thomas found himself explaining the stove's quirks, then showing her where coffee and provisions were kept. Elena listened intently, asking precise questions, occasionally making notes in a small book she kept in her pocket. Your uncle, she said as she measured coffee grounds, he does not approve of me. It wasn't a question, but Thomas answered anyway. He doesn't approve of much. But you brought me here for him, for his approval. Thomas felt a flush of shame. It's complicated. This ranch, it's Mitchell land, has been for 30 years, and you need wife to continue Mitchell name, she finished for him, her tone matter of fact. My uncle thinks so. Elena poured water into the coffee pot, her movements precise. And what does Thomas Mitchell think? The question caught him off guard. What did he think? He'd spent so long trying to meet Harold's expectations that his own desires had become secondary, distant things. I think, he said slowly, that I don't know you and you don't know me, but here we are. Elena nodded as if he'd confirmed something. Here we are. So we begin from truth, yes? Before Thomas could answer, the back door swung open and Patrick, the youngest ranch hand, stuck his head in. Sorry to interrupt, boss, but we've got trouble at the north fence line. Looks like someone cut through in the night. Calves are scattered halfway to Wilson's property. Thomas sighed. I'll saddle up. Tell the men to meet me at the big corral in 10 minutes. Patrick nodded, eyes darting curiously to Elena before he disappeared. You must go, Elena said, turning back to the stove. I will learn this house today. Thomas hesitated. The wedding's tomorrow. If you've changed your mind. Elena looked up, her expression unreadable. Have you? He hadn't, he realized. Despite everything, despite the strangeness of it all, he wanted to see what would happen next with this composed, determined woman. No, he said finally. Then we continue, she replied simply, turning back to her task. Thomas spent the day rounding up scattered calves and repairing fences, his mind continually drifting back to the house, to Elena. What was she thinking? Did she regret coming? Was she counting the hours until she was legally bound to this place, to him? He returned as the sun was setting, tired and dust-covered. The house smelled different, unfamiliar spices mingling with the usual scents of wood smoke and leather. In the kitchen, he found Elena at the stove, stirring something in his mother's old cast-iron pot. You're back, she said, glancing up. Not a question, not quite a greeting. Fence is fixed, he replied, suddenly conscious of the dirt on his clothes, the sweat on his brow. Elena nodded. Dinner is ready soon. There is water heated for washing. Thomas cleaned up quickly, changing into a fresh shirt. When he returned, he found the table set with steaming bowls of what appeared to be some kind of stew. Harold was already seated, eyeing the food suspiciously. What's this foreign mess? He demanded, as Elena placed a basket of bread beside him. Beef stew, she replied calmly, with vegetables from your garden. The recipe is mine, but the ingredients are American. Thomas sat down, surprised when Elena served him first, then Harold, before taking her own seat. The stew was unlike anything he'd tasted before, rich with unfamiliar spices, the meat tender, the vegetables perfectly cooked. This is good, he said, genuine appreciation in his voice. Elena inclined her head slightly, accepting the compliment without comment. Harold ate in silence, his expression sour despite the quality of the food. Finally, he pushed back from the table. I've spoken to Reverend Miller. He'll be here at noon tomorrow. See that you're properly dressed, he directed at Elena. A Mitchell. Bride doesn't get married looking like she just stepped off the boat. After he left, silence settled between Thomas and Elena. Thomas cleared his throat. About tomorrow? I have dress, Elena interrupted. Is white, is proper. I understand. American wedding customs. That's not, Thomas began, then stopped. How could he explain what he barely understood himself? After the ceremony, you'll move to the main house. My house, I mean. It's not far, just beyond the eastern pasture. Elena looked surprised, for the first time. Not here, not with your uncle? Thomas shook his head. I built my own place 3 years ago. It's smaller, but it's mine. Something shifted in Elena's expression, relief, perhaps, or curiosity. Then tomorrow I see my new home. Our home, Thomas corrected gently. Elena studied him for a long moment, those amber eyes thoughtful. Yes, our home. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cool. Thomas rose early, putting on his Sunday suit with uncharacteristic care. He hadn't seen Elena since the previous evening. Martha Wilson had arrived late to help her prepare and had insisted it was bad luck for the groom to see the bride before the ceremony. A small gathering awaited in the ranch's main room, which had been cleared for the occasion. Reverend Miller stood near the stone fireplace, Bible in hand. Harold sat stiffly in an armchair, looking more like he was attending a business meeting than a wedding. A few ranch hands shuffled uncomfortably by the wall, dressed in their cleanest shirts. Thomas stood by the fireplace, fighting the urge to pace. What was he doing? Marrying a woman he barely knew, bringing her into a life that might offer little happiness. Was it fair to either of them? Then the door opened, and Elena appeared on Martha Wilson's arm. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. She wore a simple white dress, high-necked and long-sleeved, trimmed with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was arranged in an elegant knot, a small spray of wildflowers tucked into the side. She carried no bouquet, but her hands were steady, clasped before her. What struck Thomas most wasn't the dress or the hair, but her eyes, direct, clear, meeting his without hesitation or pretense. This wasn't a woman entering a fairy tale. This was someone making a choice, accepting its consequences. Reverend Miller began the ceremony, his voice filling the quiet room. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." The words washed over Thomas as he stood facing Elena, seeing her truly for the first time. Not as a solution to Harold's demands, not as a foreign curiosity, but as a woman of remarkable strength standing before him, offering a partnership he hadn't known he wanted. "Do you, Thomas James Mitchell, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Thomas found his voice. "I do." "And do you, Elena Mikhailovna Sokolov, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Elena's voice was clear, her accent more pronounced in her solemnity. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride." Thomas hesitated, suddenly uncertain. They hadn't discussed this part, this intimacy between strangers. But Elena stepped forward slightly, lifting her face to his with quiet dignity. Thomas leaned down, placing the gentlest of kisses on her lips, a promise, not a claim. When he pulled back, something new flickered in Elena's eyes. Not quite. A smile, but a recognition. Whatever came next, they would face it together. There was no celebration after the ceremony, no cake or dancing. Harold shook Thomas's hand stiffly, nodded once to Elena, and left for town on urgent business. Martha Wilson offered quiet congratulations before returning to her store. The ranch hands awkwardly presented a gift, a hand-carved wooden box, for the missus's things, before returning to their duties. Then Thomas and Elena were alone, husband and wife by law, if not yet by heart, standing in the sudden quiet of the afternoon. "I should take you home," Thomas said finally, "if you're ready." Elena nodded, gathering the small bag Martha had helped her pack. "I am ready." The ride to Thomas's homestead took them past grazing cattle and through a stand of tall pines that gave the valley its name. Elena sat beside him on the wagon bench, her wedding dress carefully covered with a woolen blanket against the autumn chill. Neither spoke, the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves filling the silence between them. Occasionally, Thomas would point out landmarks, the creek that never ran dry, the hillside where wildflowers bloomed in spring, the distant ridge where he'd built a line cabin for winter emergencies. Elena took it all in with quiet attention, her eyes cataloguing everything as if committing it to memory. She was a woman of few words, Thomas realized, but none were wasted. When she did speak, her questions were practical, focused on understanding the land and its workings rather than seeking reassurance or comfort. "How many cattle you have?" she asked as they passed a group of grazing heifers. "About 500 head, split between Harold's herd and mine," Thomas replied. "I've been building my own stock these past few years, started with just 10 calves." Elena nodded, considering this. "In Russia, my father was horse breeder before revolution. Small stable, but good bloodlines." Thomas glanced at her with newfound interest. "You know horses then?" "I know how to judge good stock," she said simply, "how to spot strength in bloodline." Something in her tone made Thomas wonder if she was still talking about horses. Before he could respond, the wagon crested a small rise, revealing a modest cabin nestled against a backdrop of pines. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, and a small corral stood to one side, currently empty. "I sent Patrick ahead to light the stove," Thomas explained as he guided the horses down the slope. "It gets cold quick once the sun starts setting." The cabin was considerably smaller than Harold's grand house, but it had been built with care. The logs were precisely fitted, the windows larger than was common, allowing light to flood the interior. A covered porch wrapped around two sides with a bench positioned to catch the morning sun. Thomas helped Elena down from the wagon. Suddenly, aware of the calluses on his hands against the soft fabric of her sleeve, he hesitated, uncertain of the proper etiquette for bringing a new bride to a home she'd never seen. Elena solved the dilemma by walking steadily toward the door, her practical nature asserting itself once more. "This is our home now," she stated, not quite a question. "Yes," Thomas answered, moving ahead to open the door for her. "It's not much, but it's mine. Ours now." The interior was simple, but thoughtfully arranged. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A sturdy table with 4 chairs stood near the cast-iron stove, while a rocking chair and small sofa faced the hearth. Bookshelves lined one wall, surprisingly full for a ranch house. A door at the back presumably led to the bedroom. "You have many books," Elena observed, running a finger along the spines with what appeared to be pleasant surprise. Thomas felt a flash of self-consciousness. "My mother taught me to read before she passed. Never lost the habit." Elena nodded, as if this explained something important about him. "In Russia, books were treasures. When we fled, I could bring only 3. She reached into her small bag and withdrew 3 worn volumes bound in faded leather. Pushkin, Tolstoy, and my mother's book of folk remedies. She placed them carefully on an empty shelf, the simple act somehow transforming the space. No longer just Thomas's cabin, but their home. Thomas watched, struck by the significance of the gesture. "I should see to the horses," he said after a moment, suddenly needing air. "Make yourself at home. There's food in the pantry if you're hungry." Outside, as Thomas unhitched the horses and led them to the small stable behind the cabin, he tried to collect his thoughts. This morning he'd been a bachelor. Now he was a husband to a woman who was still largely a mystery. What did one do with a mail-order bride beyond the practical arrangements? What did she expect from him tonight? By the time he returned to the cabin, dusk had settled over the valley. The windows glowed with warm light, and when he opened the door, he was greeted by the rich aroma of something cooking. Elena had changed. From her wedding dress into a simple blue skirt and white blouse. Her hair was still up, though a few strands had escaped, softening her appearance. She worked at the stove with focused efficiency, not turning when he entered but acknowledging his presence with a slight nod. "Dinner soon," she said. "I find potatoes, salt pork in pantry." Thomas washed up at the basin near the door, the familiar routine grounding him in this unfamiliar situation. When he finished, Elena was placing 2 bowls on the table, a simple potato soup with bits of salt pork and some kind of herb he didn't recognize. They ate in companionable silence, the food warming him from the inside. It wasn't fancy, but it was good, hearty and flavorful, despite the limited ingredients. "Tomorrow I make list of what kitchen needs," Elena said as she cleared the bowls. "If you take me to town..." "Of course," Thomas replied. "We'll need supplies anyway." He paused, then added, "And perhaps some things for you, fabric or whatever you might want for the house." Elena considered this with a slight furrow between her brows. "I do not need fancy things, just practical." "Even practical things can be pleasant," Thomas found himself saying. "My mother always said a home should have touches that make the heart lighter." Elena studied him for a moment, then offered the barest hint of a smile, the first he'd seen. "Your mother sounds wise. What things lightened her heart?" Thomas hadn't expected the question, hadn't spoken of his mother in years. "Wild flowers in a jar," he said finally. "Books with colorful bindings, a blue teapot that never seemed to pour right but made her smile anyway." Elena nodded, as if filing away this information. "In Russia, my mother kept embroidered cloths on tables. Small things, bright colors. Even when food was scarce, the cloths reminded us of better times." A comfortable silence fell between them as Elena finished washing the dishes, and Thomas stoked the fire for the evening. The unspoken question of sleeping arrangements hung in the air, growing more pressing as the night deepened. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "I've prepared the bedroom for you. I'll take the bench here by the fire." Elena turned to him, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. "This is not necessary. We are married." "Yes, but..." Thomas struggled to articulate his thoughts. "I don't expect. That is, I won't demand." "I understand," Elena said quietly. "You are honorable man, but bench is too small for sleeping well. We share bed, with respect between us. When we know each other better, perhaps other things come in time." Her practical approach to even this most intimate of matters both relieved and impressed Thomas. "If you're certain." "I am certain of. View things in this new country," Elena replied with unexpected candor. "But I believe you are good man, Thomas Mitchell. This is enough to begin with trust." Dickel. The bedroom was small but comfortable, with a sturdy bed that Thomas had crafted himself, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a lamp. Elena's trunk had been placed at the foot of the bed. Thomas excused himself while Elena prepared for bed, waiting by the fire until she called softly that she was ready. She lay on the far side of the bed, her back to the center, hair loose around her shoulders. Thomas extinguished the lamp and carefully got in on his side, maintaining a respectful distance between them. The only sound was their breathing and the occasional pop from the banked fire in the other room. "Good night, Elena," Thomas said softly. "Good night, husband," she replied, the word still new and unfamiliar to both of them. Thomas woke before dawn, as was his habit, momentarily startled by the presence of another person in his bed. Elena slept soundly, her breathing deep and even. In sleep, the composed mask she wore had softened, making her look younger, more vulnerable. A strand of hair had fallen across her face, and Thomas resisted the unexpected urge to brush it back. Instead, he rose quietly and dressed in the main room, stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil before heading out to check on the horses and chicken coop. The morning air was crisp, his breath forming small clouds as he went about his chores. By the time he returned, the sun was just cresting the eastern ridge, painting the valley in golden light. Elena was already up, dressed in the same blue skirt and white blouse from the night before. Her hair was neatly braided and pinned, her sleeves rolled up as she examined the contents of the pantry with a critical eye. "Good morning," Thomas said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. Elena turned, offering a brief nod. "Morning. Coffee is ready." Thomas poured himself a cup, noticing that Elena had already drunk some. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes," she replied simply, turning back to her inventory of the pantry. We need flour, sugar, salt, vegetables if possible. We'll ride into town after breakfast, Thomas promised. The garden's finished for the season, but Martha at the general store usually has some root vegetables stored. Elena nodded, already, mixing a simple batter for flapjacks. Thomas sat at the table, watching her efficient movements as she worked. There was something soothing about her practical approach to everything, her lack of pretense or affectation. "You said your father bred horses," Thomas said after a while. "Did you work with them too?" Elena flipped a flapjack before answering. "Yes, I helped deliver foals, trained yearlings. My father said I had good hands, firm but gentle." "We could use that skill here," Thomas said. "I've been wanting to expand into horse breeding alongside the cattle. Good saddle horses fetch a fair price these days." Elena placed a plate of flapjacks before him, her expression thoughtful. "You would value my help with this?" Thomas nodded, suddenly realizing how important her answer was to him. "A partnership, like you said, your knowledge combined with mine." Something shifted in Elena's amber eyes, a cautious interest, perhaps even the beginning of enthusiasm. "In Russia, women did not usually make business decisions. Your uncle would approve?" "It's my ranch, my decision," Thomas replied with more firmness than he intended. "Harold has no say in how we run things here." Elena studied him for a moment, then sat down with her own plate. "Then I will help. It is good to work with purpose." After breakfast, they rode into town, Elena sitting straight-backed on a gentle mare Thomas had selected for her. She rode well, he noted, with the natural ease of someone who had spent years in the saddle. Her dark blue riding skirt and jacket, one of the few items she'd brought from Russia, were simply cut but well made, emphasizing her slender figure and excellent posture. Willow Creek was quiet on this post-wedding morning, though Thomas noticed curtains twitching as they passed. News of the foreign bride had spread quickly, and curiosity was at a fever pitch. He felt a protective instinct rise as they approached the general store, knowing that Elena would face scrutiny and judgment from every corner. Martha Wilson greeted them warmly as they entered, her plump face beaming. She had taken a liking to Elena from the start, being something of an outsider. Herself as a widow who ran her own business. "There's the newlyweds. Welcome, welcome. How are you settling in, Mrs. Mitchell?" Bodicides, Elena hesitated at the unfamiliar name before responding. "Well, thank you. We need supplies for kitchen, please." Martha bustled about, helping Elena select the necessary items, while Thomas checked on an order of fencing tools he'd placed the previous week. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Abigail Peterson and two other town women enter the store, making a show of examining fabric, while clearly straining to overhear Elena's conversation with Martha. "So you're from Russia? Isn't that where those anarchists come from?" Abigail's voice carried deliberately across the store. "Read in the newspaper how they're killing their betters over there." Elena's back stiffened, but her voice remained calm as she replied to Martha's question about flower preferences. The older woman shot Abigail a disapproving look, but couldn't quite quell the gossip. "Must be desperate times indeed to travel so far for a husband," continued Abigail, loud enough for the entire store to hear. "Though I suppose some might marry anyone for American citizenship." Thomas felt a surge of anger, but before he could intervene, Elena turned slowly to face Abigail. Her expression was composed, her posture regal. "In my country," she said clearly, her accent more pronounced but her English precise, "we have saying, empty barrels make most noise. Perhaps this is true in America also, yes?" Martha suppressed a snort of laughter, quickly turning it into a cough. Abigail's face flushed an unbecoming shade of red, her mouth opening and closing without producing sound. Elena turned back to her shopping list as if nothing had happened, but Thomas caught the faintest hint of satisfaction in the set of her shoulders. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon later, Thomas couldn't help but remark, "You handled Abigail Peterson better than most who've lived here all their lives." Elena secured a bag of flour before responding. "Such women exist in every village, in Petrograd, in Montana, same empty barrels, different language." Thomas laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise them both. "I've never heard it put quite that way before." Elena's lips quirked in what might almost have been a smile. "Perhaps you need more Russian sayings in your life, husband." The word still sounded formal coming from her lips, but somehow less foreign than it had the night before. Thomas found himself hoping it would eventually become as natural as breathing between them. The next weeks fell into a rhythm of shared work and gradually increasing comfort. Each morning they rose before dawn, Thomas tending to the outside chores while Elena prepared breakfast and organized the house. After eating, they would work together, checking fences, moving cattle to fresh grazing, repairing outbuildings for the coming winter. Elena proved herself capable around the ranch, her experience with horses particularly valuable. She had an eye for conformation and temperament that Thomas had to admit exceeded his own. When one of the mares fell ill with colic, it was Elena who stayed up all night, walking the animal in circles, applying hot compresses, and eventually saving its life with a concoction from her mother's book of remedies. The ranch hands, initially skeptical of the foreign woman, gradually came to respect her quiet competence and unwillingness to be coddled. She could rope a calf, mend tack, and identify a sick animal before most of them noticed anything amiss. She never complained about the hard work or rough conditions, simply tackled each task with the same determined efficiency she brought to everything. In the evenings, they would eat the simple but increasingly flavorful meals Elena prepared, then sit by the fire, Thomas with a book or ledgers, Elena with mending or her journal. Conversation between them was still sparse but growing, more comfortable, focused mainly on the practical aspects of running the ranch. They continued to share the bed with a respectful distance between them, though Thomas found himself increasingly aware of Elena's presence, the light scent of lavender she somehow maintained despite the rustic conditions, the gentle rhythm of her breathing as she slept, the cascade of her hair when she removed the pins at night. 2 weeks after the wedding, Harold Mitchell made his first visit to the cabin. Thomas saw his uncle's buggy approaching from the north pasture, where he and Elena were checking cattle. His stomach tightened at the sight. "My uncle comes," he told Elena, who straightened on her horse, unconsciously adjusting her posture as if preparing for battle. They rode back to the cabin together, reaching it just as Harold was climbing down from his buggy. The older man's critical gaze swept over them both, lingering disapprovingly on Elena's practical riding clothes. "So this is where you've been hiding your bride," Harold said by way of greeting. "Thought you might have sent her back to Russia by now." "Elena belongs here," Thomas replied evenly, "and we've been working, not hiding." Harold grunted, following them into the cabin. His eyes catalogued everything, the neatly kept room. The books with Cyrillic titles on the shelf, the embroidered cloth Elena had placed on the table. His expression soured at this last detail. "I see she's bringing her foreign ways into your home already," he remarked, gesturing to the cloth with its bright red and blue pattern. "I bring what skills I have," Elena said calmly, putting coffee on to boil. "Embroidery makes home pleasant without costing much." Harold ignored her, turning to Thomas. "We need to move the northern herd to winter pasture earlier than planned. Weather report says snow's coming by month's end." Thomas nodded. "I've been watching the signs myself. We can start tomorrow if the hands are ready." "Already gave the order," Harold said dismissively. "You'll take point on the North Ridge. Should take 3, maybe 4 days to move them all." Elena placed a cup of coffee before Harold without comment, then busied herself at the stove. Thomas noticed how she positioned herself to hear every word while appearing occupied with other tasks. 4 days is too long, she said suddenly, surprising both men. Storm clouds gathering wrong, 3 days at most before snow. Harold's face darkened. I don't recall asking for a weather prediction from a foreigner who's never seen a Montana. Winter. Weather has no nationality, Elena replied, her voice steady. Signs are same everywhere if you know how to read them. Elena has good instincts, Thomas interjected, feeling the tension build. She's been right about every weather change since she arrived. Instincts, Harold scoffed. What we need is experience and tradition, not foreign superstitions. Elena's back stiffened, but she said nothing more, continuing her work at the stove. Thomas felt a surge of protectiveness, coupled with frustration at his own hesitation to defend her more vigorously. Harold had been his guardian, had taught him everything he knew about ranching, but the constant dismissal of Elena grated more with each passing day. After finishing his coffee, Harold rose to leave. At the door, he paused, looking back at Elena. Sunday's church social. People expect to see Thomas's new wife there, properly dressed. See that you don't embarrass the Mitchell name. After he left, silence hung in the cabin. Thomas turned to find Elena methodically kneading bread dough, her movements perhaps more forceful than necessary. I'm sorry about Harold, he began. Do not apologize for other man's words, Elena said, echoing what she'd told him on their first night. You are not responsible for his thoughts. Thomas moved closer, noticing the tension in her shoulders. You're right about the weather. I'll make sure we move the herd quickly. Elena nodded without looking up. The social on Sunday, you wish me to go? Thomas hesitated. The church social would mean placing Elena squarely before the entire community, exposing her to more of the curiosity and potential cruelty they'd encountered at the general store. Yet avoiding it would only fuel gossip and give credence to those who claimed he was ashamed of his foreign bride. I think we should go, he said finally. Not for Harold, but for ourselves. This is our community now, for better or worse. Elena looked up then, her amber eyes meeting his directly. I have one dress suitable for church. Is plain, but clean. You'll look fine, Thomas assured her. It's not about the dress anyway. No, Elena agreed with surprising insight. It is about showing I am not afraid, and you are not ashamed. That night, as they prepared for bed, Thomas found himself watching Elena as she removed the pins from her hair, the chestnut waves cascading down her back. A question that had been on his mind for days finally found its way to his lips. Why did you agree to come here? To marry a stranger? Elena's hands stilled for a moment before she resumed brushing her hair. After revolution, life in Russia became dangerous for families like mine. Father was killed for having owned horses that nobles once bought. Mother died of illness year after. I had choice. Marry cousin who supported new regime or find way out. She set down the brush, turning to face Thomas. Your advertisement said, seeking practical wife for ranch partnership, not seeking beautiful woman or seeking obedient woman. Practical partnership, this I could respect. And now, Thomas asked quietly, is it what you expected? Elena considered the question seriously. No, she said finally. It is harder in some ways. The stares, the whispers, your uncle's disapproval, but better in others. She hesitated, then added, you are kind man, Thomas Mitchell. This was not promised in advertisement. Something warmed in Thomas's chest at her words. I'm trying to be fair, at least. Fair is good beginning, Elena said simply. Rest will come with time. Sunday arrived clear and cold, the first true hint of the approaching winter. Elena dressed carefully in her one good dress, a deep blue wool with simple lines and a lace collar that framed her face. She pinned her hair in a neat arrangement that softened her features while remaining modest enough for church. Thomas, watching her preparations, was struck by how elegant she looked, despite the simplicity of her attire. There was a natural dignity to Elena that no amount of fancy trimmings could have enhanced. "You look beautiful," he said, the words emerging before he could consider them. Elena's eyes widened slightly in surprise. A faint color touched her cheeks as she smoothed her skirt. "Thank you," she replied softly. The small church was already filled when they arrived, the service about to begin. Their entrance caused a ripple of whispers and turned heads. Thomas guided Elena to a pew near the middle, conscious of the eyes following them. Harold sat near the front, giving them a curt nod before facing forward again. Reverend Miller offered them a warm smile before beginning the service. Elena followed along attentively, though Thomas knew many of the prayers and hymns must be unfamiliar to her. When the collection plate came around, she placed a small embroidered handkerchief alongside Thomas's coins, a gesture that earned curious glances from those nearby. After the service came the social tables set up outside the church, laden with food brought by the congregation. Women clustered in groups, eyeing Elena with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. Men nodded respectfully to Thomas while stealing glances at his new wife. Martha Wilson was the first to approach them, bringing Elena a plate of food and introducing her to her sister from the next town over. Soon, a few of the younger women joined them, curiosity overcoming caution. Thomas watched from a distance as Elena answered their questions with patient dignity, neither hiding her foreign origins nor apologizing for them. "Looks like your Russian's holding her own," remarked Sheriff Dawson, coming to stand beside Thomas. "Heard she put Abigail Peterson in her place at the general store. Wish I'd been there to see it." Thomas smiled slightly. Elena has a way with words, even with her limited English. Limited, maybe, but effective from what I hear. How's she taking to ranch life? "Better than anyone could have expected," Thomas replied honestly. "She knows horses, understands weather patterns, works from dawn till dusk without complaint." The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "Different from what folks assumed, I reckon. Most thought you'd got yourself a helpless city girl who'd be running back to Russia at the first cattle drive." "Elena's not one for running," Thomas said, a note of pride entering his voice. Across the churchyard, he could see Abigail Peterson and her circle standing apart, their expressions disapproving as they watched Elena. Occasionally, they would laugh behind their hands, glancing pointedly at Elena's simple dress or gesturing to her hair. Thomas felt a surge of anger, but before he could move, he saw Elena excuse herself from Martha's group and walk directly toward Abigail's circle. The women fell silent as she approached, their expressions a mixture of surprise and disdain. "Mrs. Peterson," Elena said clearly, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "I bring you this." She held out a small embroidered handkerchief similar to the one she had placed in the collection plate. The delicate blue flowers along its border were exquisitely rendered, the stitching so fine it looked almost painted. "My mother taught that when someone speaks against you, best response is unexpected kindness. In Russia, we give small gift to show we seek peace between houses. Please accept." Abigail stared at the handkerchief, momentarily speechless. Around them, conversation had died as people watched the exchange. To refuse the gift would be to admit animosity. To accept it meant acknowledging Elena's gesture of goodwill. Slowly, Abigail reached out and took the handkerchief. "Thank you," she said stiffly. Elena nodded once, then turned and walked back toward Thomas, her posture straight, her expression serene. As she passed, he heard the murmurs of approval from several of the older women in the congregation. "That was well done," Thomas said quietly when she reached his side. "Is not first difficult woman I have met." Elena replied with the barest hint of humor in her eyes. "Will not be last." As they prepared to leave, Harold approached them, his expression unreadable. He nodded to Elena, the closest thing to acknowledgement he had offered since the wedding. "Weather's turning," he said to Thomas. "Your wife was right about the storm. We'll finish moving the herd tomorrow." It wasn't an apology, not even close, but it was a concession, a small recognition of Elena's knowledge. Thomas saw her receive it with a slight inclination of her head, neither gloating nor seeking further approval. On the ride home, as the first few snowflakes began to drift from the darkening sky, Thomas found himself studying his wife's profile against the gathering dusk. Something had shifted today, both between them and in how others saw them. The foreign bride was becoming something else, a Mitchell wife, yes, but on her own terms, maintaining her dignity and identity in the face of suspicion and judgment. "You made an impression today," he said, as the cabin came into view, smoke already rising from the chimney where Patrick had lit the fire before leaving for the bunkhouse. Elena glanced at him, a question in her amber eyes. "A good one," Thomas clarified. Even Harold noticed. "I do not seek his approval," Elena said carefully, "but is easier if he does not work against us." Us. The word hung between them, simple, yet profound. Not you, not me, but us. A partnership forming despite the unusual circumstances of their union. As they reached the cabin, the snow began to fall in earnest, large flakes swirling in the wind that had picked up from the north. Thomas helped Elena down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. She looked up at him, snowflakes catching in her lashes and hair, her cheeks flushed from the cold. For a moment, Thomas felt an urge to pull her closer, to discover if her lips would feel as soft as they looked. Instead, he stepped back, gesturing toward the warmth of the cabin. "We should get inside," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Storm's coming in fast." Elena studied his face for a moment, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. Then she nodded, gathering her skirts and moving toward the door. "Yes," she agreed softly, "but sometimes storms bring unexpected things." Thomas watched her disappear into the cabin, wondering if they were still talking about the weather. The storm that Elena had predicted swept across Pine Valley with surprising fury, transforming the landscape overnight. Thomas woke before dawn, to find the world outside their cabin windows blanketed in white, the familiar contours of the ranch obscured beneath 2 feet of snow. Beside him, Elena still slept, her breathing deep and even, one hand curled beneath her cheek. In repose, her features softened, the careful composure she maintained during waking hours giving way to something more vulnerable. Thomas slipped quietly from the bed, careful not to wake her. He stoked the dying embers in the fireplace, adding logs until flames licked upward, casting a warm glow throughout the cabin. Outside, the wind howled around the eaves, rattling the shutters he'd secured the night before. His mind turned to the cattle. They'd managed to move most of the herd to the sheltered winter pasture, but at least 50 head remained in the north section. If the snow continued, they could lose those animals to exposure or starvation. "You worry for cattle," Elena's voice came from behind him, startling him from his thoughts. Thomas turned to find her standing in the bedroom doorway, a woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her hair loose around her face. "Did I wake you?" She shook her head. "Storm woke me. You think of animals still in Northfield?" Thomas nodded, unsurprised by her perceptiveness. In just a few weeks, Elena had developed an intuitive understanding of ranch operations and of him. 50 head at least. They'll need hay if this keeps up. Elena moved to the window, peering out at the swirling snow. "Road to Harold's ranch will be blocked. Telephone lines probably down." They had no telephone at the cabin, relying on the line at Harold's main house for emergencies. Thomas ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I should ride out, check on the cattle." "Not alone," Elena said firmly. "Too dangerous in such storm." "I can't just leave them," Thomas argued. "A cow's worth good money. 50 head is not worth your life," Elena interrupted, turning to face him fully. Her amber eyes were serious in the firelight. "We go together once storm lessens. 2 people safer than 1. Thomas started to protest, but stopped himself. Elena was right, as she often was, about practical matters. Riding out alone in a blizzard was foolhardy at best, suicidal at worst. Still, the thought of those animals suffering gnawed at him. Elena seemed to read his thoughts. "Animals are stronger than you think. Cattle huddle together, find shelter where they can. We wait 3 hours. If snow slows, we go together with supplies." Her decisive tone left little room for argument. Thomas nodded reluctantly, recognizing the wisdom in her plan. 3 hours, then. They spent those hours preparing, gathering rope, blankets, dried food, and medical supplies. Elena packed everything efficiently into saddlebags, while Thomas prepared a hot breakfast that would sustain them through the morning's work. The domesticity of the scene struck Thomas suddenly. This seamless partnership that had developed between them in such a short time. As promised, the storm began to abate after 3 hours, the howling wind diminishing to occasional gusts. The snow continued to fall, but lighter now, the visibility improved enough to make travel possible, if not pleasant. They dressed in layers, Elena donning the heavy wool trousers and coat that Thomas had purchased for her after her first week on the ranch. Her practical nature had overcome any concern about wearing men's clothing for ranch work, though she still maintained proper dress for town and social occasions. "You sure you want to come?" Thomas asked as they prepared the horses. "It'll be rough going." Elena adjusted her scarf, tucking it securely around her neck. "I am sure." 2 sets of eyes better than 1. They set out into the transformed landscape, the horses picking their way carefully through drifts that sometimes reached their chests. Thomas led, following the fence line that would guide them to the northern pasture. The world had gone strangely silent, the snow muffling all sound except the crunch of hooves and the occasional snort of their mounts. Elena rode beside him when the trail allowed, slightly behind when it narrowed. Thomas found himself glancing back frequently, reassured by her steady presence. She sat her horse with easy confidence, her posture erect despite the difficult conditions, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. They reached the northern pasture after an hour of difficult travel. At first glance, it appeared empty, a pristine field of white unmarked by cattle. Thomas felt his heart sink. If the herd had scattered in the storm, finding them would be nearly impossible. "There," Elena said suddenly, pointing toward a stand of pines at the far end of the pasture. "Look at trees." Thomas squinted through the falling snow. Finally, making out what Elena had spotted immediately, a dark mass huddled beneath the sheltering branches of the pines. The cattle had instinctively sought refuge, clustering together for warmth and protection. Relief washed over him. "Good eyes," he told Elena with genuine admiration. "I would have missed them." She accepted the compliment with a slight nod, already, urging her horse toward the trees. "They need food. Some may be weak from cold." The cattle had indeed weathered the storm better than Thomas had feared. Huddled together beneath the pines, they had created enough body heat to keep from freezing. Still, several calves looked dangerously weak, and one cow lay on her side, breathing heavily, unable to rise. They worked together with wordless efficiency, distributing the hay they'd brought, checking each animal for frostbite or injury. Elena moved among the cattle with gentle confidence, her hands sure as she examined eyes and ears, her voice a soothing murmur in Russian that seemed to calm even the most skittish animals. The cow that couldn't rise presented the greatest challenge. Hip might be broken, Thomas said after examining her, or she might just be too weak to stand. Elena knelt in the snow beside the animal, running her hands along its side with methodical care. Not broken, she concluded. Exhausted and cold, need to get her up, get blood flowing. Together, they rigged a system of ropes and leverage, working patiently to help the struggling animal to her feet. The cow bellowed in protest, but eventually stood swaying, her eyes rolling in fear and exhaustion. "She needs shelter," Elena said, wiping sweat from her brow despite the cold. "Will not survive another night in open." Thomas nodded, calculating distances and options. "Line cabin's about 2 miles east. If we can get her there, the rest should be fine here with the hay we've left." Moving the injured cow proved to be a slow, painstaking process. Thomas led while Elena walked behind, keeping the animal moving forward with gentle persistence. The snow had stopped falling, but the temperature was dropping rapidly as afternoon waned toward evening. By the time they reached the line cabin, all three were exhausted. The small, one-room structure was basic but sound, built to shelter cowboys during seasonal work or emergency situations exactly like this one. Thomas quickly started a fire in the small stove, while Elena settled the cow in the attached lean-to, covering her with one of the blankets they'd brought. Inside, the cabin gradually warmed. Elena rubbed her hands together near the stove, her cheeks and nose reddened from cold, her hair escaping its braid in damp tendrils. Thomas suddenly realized how exhausted she must be. They'd been battling the elements for hours, performing physically demanding work in extreme conditions. "You should rest," he said, gesturing to the narrow cot against one wall. "I'll check on the cow again." Elena shook her head. "I will check cow. You make something hot to drink." Before he could protest, she had slipped back outside into the gathering dusk. Thomas shook his head ruefully, recognizing the futility of arguing with her. Instead, he melted snow in a pot on the stove, adding coffee from their supplies. When Elena returned, her expression was satisfied. "Cow drinks water, eats little hay. Good signs. We should stay night here. Return home tomorrow when she is stronger." The practical implications of her statement hung in the air between them. The line cabin had only one small cot, barely wide enough for one person, let alone two. "I'll sleep on the floor," Thomas said quickly. "You take the cot." Elena gave him a look he was beginning to recognize, part exasperation, part determination. "Floor is cold. Cot is small, but can fit two if we are close. We are married, Thomas Mitchell, and very cold." She stated it as simple fact, stripping the situation of awkwardness or impropriety. They were indeed married, and the practicalities of survival outweighed conventional proprieties. Still, Thomas felt a flutter of uncertainty. Since their wedding night, they had maintained a respectful distance even while sharing his bed. This would be different, necessarily close, intimate in a way they had not yet been. Elena seemed to sense his hesitation. "I make no demands," she said quietly. "Only practical suggestion for warmth. Nothing more." Her directness, as always, cut through his uncertainty. "You're right," he conceded. "It's the sensible thing to do." They ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, sharing the hot coffee between them. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, the clear sky after the storm bringing bitter cold in its wake. Their breath fogged in the air despite the stove's efforts. Elena checked on the cow once more before they settled for the night. "She sleeps standing," she reported with satisfaction. "Will recover, I think." The logistics of sharing the narrow cot required some negotiation. Eventually, they lay on their sides, Elena's back to Thomas's chest, his arm awkwardly hovering until she took it and wrapped it around her waist. "For balance," she explained practically. "So you do not fall." Her hair smelled faintly of wood smoke and the lavender oil she used sparingly. Thomas was acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched, her shoulder blades against his chest, her hips aligned with his, her feet tangled with his for warmth. He held himself rigid, afraid to move, lest she misinterpret his intentions. "You are uncomfortable," Elena observed after a few minutes of this tension. "No, Thomas began, then sighed. "A little. I don't want to presume." Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "In Russia, before revolution, marriages were often arranged. My grandmother told me many began as strangers, became friends, then perhaps more. Time builds trust. Trust builds feeling." "Is that what you want?" Thomas asked, the darkness making it easier to voice the question. "For us to become more than we are now?" Elena didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was thoughtful. "I came to America for safe home, honest work, respect. These things you give already. If more comes, it should come naturally, not from obligation." Her pragmatic approach touched Thomas unexpectedly. There was no artifice in Elena, no manipulation or false sentiment. She faced their unusual situation with the same straightforward determination she brought to everything else. "You're an extraordinary woman, Elena Sokolov Mitchell," Thomas said softly. She shifted slightly, her body relaxing against his. "And you are a good man, Thomas Mitchell. Now sleep. Tomorrow is long ride home." Exhaustion soon overcame any remaining awkwardness, and Thomas drifted off to the sound of Elena's steady breathing and the occasional shifting of the cow in the adjacent lean-to. He woke once in the night to find that they had shifted positions. Elena was now curled against his chest, her head tucked under his chin, one hand resting over his heart. Her face in deep sleep looked younger. The careful composure she maintained during waking hours softened into something almost vulnerable. Thomas resisted an impulse to brush a strand of hair from her cheek, afraid of waking her. Instead, he simply held her, allowing himself to acknowledge a growing truth. He was coming to care for this woman in ways that had nothing to do with their arrangement. Morning brought clear skies and bitter cold. They rose before dawn. Elena immediately, checking on the cow while Thomas rekindled the fire and prepared coffee. The animal had improved overnight, now alert and eating the remaining hay with good appetite. "She can travel," Elena pronounced, returning to the cabin with her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Slowly, but she will make it." They packed their few supplies and set out as the sun crested the eastern mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold. The injured cow followed obediently behind Elena's horse, apparently having bonded with her caretaker overnight. The return journey was slow, but uneventful. They stopped twice to rest the cow, using these breaks to check on the rest of the herd as well. All had survived the night, clustering together beneath the pines, just as Elena had predicted they would. It was mid-afternoon when they finally approached the cabin, smoke rising welcomingly from the chimney. Thomas was puzzled by this until he spotted a familiar buggy tied outside. "Harold's here," he said to Elena, who straightened almost imperceptibly in her saddle. The door opened as they approached, Harold emerging with a scowl that deepened when he saw Elena in her men's clothing, leading the injured cow. "Been looking everywhere for you two," he called out. "Thought you might have frozen to death in that storm." "We went to check the north herd," Thomas explained as he dismounted. "Found this one down. Had to take her to the line cabin for the night." Harold's gaze shifted from Thomas to Elena, then to the cow. "Waste of time for one scrawny cow," he muttered. Though Thomas noted he didn't suggest they should have left the animal to die, Elena dismounted, leading the cow toward the small barn. "I will settle her with hay and fresh water," she said, pointedly ignoring Harold's comment. "Your wife's taken to wearing trousers, I see," Harold remarked after she'd gone. Disapproval. evident in his tone. "For ranch work," Thomas replied evenly. "It's practical." Harold snorted. "Practical. That's her favorite word, isn't it? Next thing you know, she'll be cutting her hair and demanding the right to vote." Thomas felt a flash of irritation. "Elena works harder than most men I know. How she dresses to do that work is her business, and mine." A tense silence fell. Between them, Harold broke it with a gruff change of subject. "Storm took down part of the east fence. Need to get it repaired before the cattle find the gap." They discussed ranch business for several minutes. Damage from the storm, supplies needed from town, plans for the upcoming cattle sale. Thomas was aware of Harold watching Elena through the barn door as she tended to the injured cow, his expression unreadable. "Thought she'd have run back to Russia by now," Harold said abruptly, interrupting a discussion about feed prices. "Most city women would have. Elena's not most women," Thomas replied, "and she wasn't raised in a city. Her family bred horses before the revolution." Harold grunted, something almost like approval in the sound. "Explains why she knows livestock. Still, a foreign woman is exactly what this ranch needed," Thomas finished firmly. "She predicted that storm 3 days before it hit, saved us from losing the entire North herd." Harold was silent for a moment, studying his nephew with shrewd eyes. "You're sweet on her," he stated flatly, "not just doing your duty anymore." Thomas felt heat rise to his face, but didn't deny it. "She's my wife." "She's a mail-order bride you got stuck with," Harold corrected. "Doesn't mean you had to start having feelings." "Maybe I didn't have to," Thomas said quietly, "but I do." The admission hung in the air between them. Harold shook his head slowly. "Well, I suppose there are worse things. At least she works hard, doesn't complain like most women." Coming from Harold, this was practically a ringing endorsement. Thomas hid his surprise, simply nodding in acknowledgement. Harold departed shortly afterward, leaving Thomas to help Elena with the evening chores. They worked in companionable silence, the routine familiar after weeks of shared tasks. Only when they were inside, warming themselves by the fire after feeding the animals, did Thomas mention his conversation with Harold. "He almost said something nice about you," Thomas remarked, watching Elena's reaction carefully. She looked up from the stew she was stirring, one eyebrow raised in disbelief. "Nice. Harold Mitchell." Thomas smiled at her skepticism. "He acknowledged that you work hard and don't complain. From him, that's practically a declaration of affection." Elena returned to her stirring, but Thomas caught the slight curl of her lips. "Low standards for affection in Mitchell family, I think." The comment was delivered with dry humor, a side of Elena that emerged more frequently now that they were growing comfortable with each other. Thomas found himself laughing, enjoying this glimpse of wit beneath her practical exterior. "He also said I was sweet on you," Thomas added without planning to, the words slipping out before he could reconsider. Elena's hands stilled for the briefest moment before resuming their work. "And what did you say to this?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Thomas hesitated, suddenly uncertain. Had he misread the subtle shifts in their relationship? The increasing comfort, the moments of connection, the way she had slept in his arms last night. Did they mean something different to her than they did to him? "I didn't deny it," he said finally, opting for honesty. "Because it's true." Elena set down her spoon and turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "This is not part of our arrangement, Thomas." "I know," he acknowledged. "It wasn't planned. In Russia, we have saying, the heart asks no permission." She studied him intently, but arrangements like ours are complicated. Feelings can be confused with gratitude, with duty. Thomas moved closer, stopping an arm's length away, respecting her space. "Is that what you think this is? Confusion?" Elena considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. I think we are still learning each other. Learning to trust. Trust must come before heart. Do you trust me, Elena? Thomas asked quietly. Her amber eyes met his directly. More each day, she admitted. And you? Do you trust foreign wife who came with contract, not love? I trust the woman who saved my cow, who stands up to Harold, who faces down gossips at church with dignity, Thomas replied. I trust you, Elena. The rest can come with time, if you're willing. A smile, a real one, not the slight curl of lips she usually allowed, transformed Elena's face. Time we have, she said softly. Now come eat stew before it burns. The matter-of-fact transition from emotional disclosure to practical concerns was so typically Elena that Thomas couldn't help but smile. They ate dinner discussing mundane matters, repairs needed on the roof, plans for expanding the chicken coop, the condition of the injured cow. Yet something had changed between them, an acknowledgement that their arrangement was becoming something more than either had anticipated. That night, when they prepared for bed, the careful distance they had maintained seemed suddenly awkward, artificial. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, brushing her hair with long, methodical strokes, her expression thoughtful. "In-line cabin," she said abruptly, setting down the brush. "It was good to be warm together." Thomas, who had been banking the fire for the night, turned to look at her. "It was," he agreed cautiously. Elena patted the space beside her on the bed. "Cold night again. No need for distance if we both wish to be close." The straightforward invitation, delivered in her practical way, touched Thomas deeply. There was no artifice in Elena, no coy games or manipulation, just honest communication of her wishes. He sat beside her, their shoulders touching lightly. Slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, he reached up to touch her cheek. Elena didn't pull away, her amber eyes steady on his. "May I kiss you?" Thomas asked softly. "Not because we're married by law, but because I want to." "Yes," Elena replied simply, "because I want it too." Their first real kiss was gentle, tentative, the meeting of two people gradually finding their way from arrangement to affection. Elena's lips were soft beneath his, responding with a warmth that suggested she had been waiting for this moment as well. When they parted, Elena's eyes remained closed for a moment, her expression one of careful consideration. When she opened them, Thomas saw a new openness there, a willingness to explore this unexpected development between them. "So," she said, practicality reasserting itself, "not just arrangement anymore." Thomas smiled, taking her hand in his. "Not just arrangement," he agreed. "Something more." They settled into bed that night without the careful distance of previous weeks. Elena curled against Thomas's side, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. It was a simple intimacy, comfortable and undemanding, yet it represented a significant shift in their relationship, a choice made freely rather than dictated by contract or convention. As winter settled fully over, Pine Valley, life at the Mitchell cabin developed new rhythms. Days were filled with the constant work of maintaining the ranch through the harsh season, breaking ice on water troughs, distributing hay to snowbound cattle, repairing equipment in preparation for spring. The injured cow, which Elena had named Zvezda, star in Russian for the white marking on her forehead, recovered fully and became something of a pet, following Elena whenever she ventured near the barn. Evenings brought new pleasures. Instead of sitting in companionable but separate silence, they now shared the sofa before the fire, Elena often reading aloud from one of her Russian books, translating as she went. Thomas found himself enchanted by the strange, lyrical stories, so different from the practical cowboy tales and dime novels that constituted most of Pine Valley's literary diet. Physical affection grew between them gradually, naturally. A brush of hands while passing coffee, a touch on the shoulder while discussing ranch matters, a kiss, good morning or good night. Small gestures that built a bridge between duty and desire. News of the storm's damage brought unexpected visitors to the cabin. Sheriff Dawson rode out to check on outlying ranches, bringing mail and town gossip. Dr. Carter came to treat a ranch hand's broken arm and stayed for dinner, engaging Elena in a long discussion about Russian herbal remedies that left him impressed with her knowledge. Even Harold's visits took on a different tone. While never warm, he began to address questions about livestock directly to Elena, grudgingly acknowledging her expertise. When she suggested a new technique for protecting newborn calves from the bitter cold, a practice from her homeland, he actually implemented it, though he never directly admitted it was her idea. It was during one such visit, as Harold and Thomas discussed plans for the spring cattle drive, that Elena noticed Harold wincing whenever he moved his right arm. "Your shoulder pains you," she observed during a lull in the conversation. Harold frowned, instinctively defensive, just stiff from the cold. Nothing serious. Elena studied him with a professional eye. "Is more than stiff. Inflammation, perhaps. Old injury. I have liniment that will help." "Don't need foreign medicines," Harold grumbled, but Elena had already disappeared into the bedroom, returning with a small jar from her trunk. "Take off coat," she instructed, her tone brooking no argument. "Roll up sleeve." To Thomas's astonishment, Harold complied, though with much muttering and scowling. Elena examined the shoulder with careful professional hands, her touch clinical rather than personal. "Old break, never set right," she diagnosed. "Common in horsemen. This will help pain but should be applied every night for 2 weeks." She demonstrated the proper application of the strong-smelling liniment, her movements efficient and impersonal. Harold submitted to the treatment with poor grace, but obvious relief as the medication began to work. "What's in this?" he asked, gruffly rolling down his sleeve. "Herbs from Russia mixed with local plants I find here. Horse liniment recipe from my grandfather, adjusted for human use." Elena handed him the jar. "Take it. Make Patrick help you apply each night." Harold accepted the jar with grudging thanks. As he was leaving, he turned to Thomas on the porch, speaking low enough that Elena, who had returned to the kitchen, couldn't hear. "She knows her business," he admitted reluctantly. "Might be foreign, but she's got good sense, better than most American women I know." It was as close to approval as Harold Mitchell was likely to ever express. Thomas hid his smile, simply nodding in agreement. "She does indeed." After Harold left, Thomas found Elena at the stove, stirring a pot of stew. He slipped his arms around her waist from behind, a gesture that had become natural in recent weeks. "You've conquered the fearsome Harold Mitchell," he murmured against her hair. "First the shoulder liniment, next he'll be asking you to run the entire ranch." Elena leaned back slightly against him, continuing her stirring. "Not conquered, just found use for my knowledge. All people want to be valued for what they know, what they can do, even Harold Mitchell." Her insight struck Thomas as profound in its simplicity. Elena had a gift for seeing to the heart of people and situations, cutting through pretense to the essential truth. "How did you get so wise?" he asked, only half joking. Elena turned in his arms, her expression serious. "Not wisdom, survival. When you lose everything, home, family, country, you learn to see what matters. Pride matters less than pain. Tradition matters less than truth." Thomas studied her face, still struck sometimes by the quiet strength there. "I'm glad you came here," he said softly. "Even if it wasn't how either of us would have chosen to meet." A smile touched Elena's lips. Sometimes unexpected paths lead to best destinations. As she turned back to her cooking, Thomas realized how profoundly his life had changed in the few months since Elena's arrival. What had begun as an obligation, a duty to family legacy, had transformed into something he valued more than he could have imagined. The foreign bride, once viewed as little more than a practical necessity, had become essential to his happiness in ways that transcended any contract or arrangement. A rapping at the door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas opened it to find Patrick, the young ranch hand, his expression urgent. "Trouble at the main house, boss," he said breathlessly. "Harold's taken a fall. Doc Carter's been sent for, but he's asking for you and—" He hesitated, glancing past Thomas to where Elena stood in the kitchen doorway. "And for Mrs. Mitchell." Thomas and Elena exchanged a quick glance, communication passing between them without words. "Saddle the horses," Thomas instructed Patrick. "We'll follow right away." The ride to Harold's ranch house took them through nightfall, the temperature dropping sharply as darkness enveloped Pine Valley. Elena rode beside Thomas, her face half hidden by a woolen scarf, but her eyes alert and focused. They barely spoke. During the journey, each lost in their own thoughts about what might await them. Stars had emerged by the time they dismounted in front of the imposing Mitchell ranch house. Lights blazed from every window, and several horses were already tied. At the hitching post, Dr. Carter had arrived, along with Reverend Miller, whose presence suggested the situation might be grave indeed. Martha Wilson met them at the door, her usually cheerful face drawn with worry. "Thank heavens you're here," she said, taking their coats. "He's been asking for you both since it happened." "How bad is it?" Thomas asked, unwrapping his scarf. Martha's eyes darted to Elena, then back to Thomas. "Bad enough. Broke his hip and maybe some ribs when the horse threw him. Doc's with him now." Elena had already removed her outdoor garments and was rolling up her sleeves. "I need hot water." "Clean cloths," she said decisively, "and my bag from saddle." Martha looked startled but nodded, gesturing to a ranch hand to fetch Elena's things. Thomas touched Elena's arm gently. "Are you sure you want to be involved? Harold might not welcome—" "Not about welcome," Elena interrupted firmly. "About helping. Where is he?" Martha led them upstairs to Harold's bedroom, a large chamber dominated by a massive four-poster bed where the old rancher lay, his face gray with pain. Dr. Carter stood nearby, closing his medical bag with a grim expression. "Thomas," Harold rasped when he saw them. "About time you got here." Thomas moved to the bedside, shocked by his uncle's appearance. Harold Mitchell had always seemed indestructible, a force of nature rather than a mere man. Now he looked suddenly old, diminished by pain and vulnerability. "What happened?" Thomas asked, pulling up a chair. "Damn new stallion," Harold muttered. "Spooked at nothing. I'm not as quick as I used to be." Dr. Carter approached, his voice low. "Multiple fractures, hips the worst. At his age and in his condition." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Thomas understood the prognosis in the doctor's tone. A broken hip at Harold's age, miles from proper medical facilities, was often a death sentence, slow but certain. Elena had entered the room quietly, setting her bag on a nearby table and washing her hands in the basin Martha had provided. Now she stepped forward, her presence drawing Harold's attention. "The Russian," he acknowledged, his voice weaker than before. "Come to see the old man fall." "Come to help," Elena corrected calmly, moving to the other side of the bed. "With permission." Harold studied her face for a moment, then gave a slight nod, the closest thing to humility Thomas had ever seen from his uncle. Elena turned to Dr. Carter. "May I examine—" The doctor hesitated, clearly surprised by the request. "Mrs. Mitchell, I don't think—" "My father was horse breeder," Elena interrupted. "I set many broken bones, sometimes with tools, sometimes with herbs when doctor too far away. May I look?" Dr. Carter glanced at Thomas, who nodded encouragement. "She knows what she's doing, Doc." With reluctant permission granted, Elena began a careful examination of Harold's injuries, her touch gentle but thorough. Her expression remained neutral as she worked, asking occasional questions of Dr. Carter about symptoms and treatments already administered. Finally, she straightened, addressing both men. Hip break is serious, as doctor says, but not impossible. In Russia, we use method to set such breaks even in old people. If done correctly, with proper care after, many recover. What method? Dr. Carter asked, professional curiosity overcoming his initial skepticism. Elena described a technique involving traction and manipulation, followed by a rigorous regimen of herbal poultices to reduce inflammation and specialized exercises to strengthen surrounding muscles. She spoke with such quiet authority that even Harold listened without interruption. "Never heard of such a procedure," Dr. Carter admitted when she finished, "but conventional methods offer little hope in this case." "I've seen it work," Elena said simply, "but it requires trust and patience, many weeks of careful treatment." All eyes turned to Harold, who had remained uncharacteristically silent during Elena's explanation. The old rancher's face was unreadable as he considered her words. "Why would you help me?" he asked finally, his voice rough with pain. "And perhaps something else? Humility or confusion at being offered help from the foreign bride he had so often dismissed. "I've been nothing but hard on you since you came." Elena met his gaze directly, her expression matter of fact. "You are Thomas's family. That makes you my family too, even if you do not wish it. In Russia, family duty is sacred duty." The simplicity of her answer seemed to affect Harold deeply. He studied her face for a long moment, then gave a single sharp nod. "Do what you can then. Not like I have much choice." "I'll need assistant," Elena said, turning to Dr. Carter. "You will help?" The doctor nodded, professional interest clearly piqued. "I'd like to learn this technique. If you can teach me, I'm at your disposal." What followed was an intense session that tested everyone's endurance. Thomas assisted where he could, fetching water, holding lamps, and offering support to his uncle during the most painful moments of the procedure. Martha mixed poultices under Elena's precise instruction, measuring herbs from Elena's carefully packed stores. Throughout it all, Elena worked with focused concentration, her hands sure and steady, her instructions clear and calm, even when Harold cursed from pain or Dr. Carter questioned her methods. She never faltered, never showed doubt, proceeding with the unwavering confidence of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. By midnight, the worst was over. Harold lay exhausted but properly set, his hip immobilized according to Elena's specifications. The first of many poultices applied to reduce inflammation, Dr. Carter watched with undisguised admiration as Elena explained the next steps in treatment. "The poultice must be changed every 4 hours for 3 days, she instructed, then twice daily for 2 weeks. Exercise begins small, tiny movements at first, then gradually more." "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Carter admitted, making notes in a small book. "Where did you learn this technique?" "My grandmother was healer in village," Elena explained as she washed her hands. "She learned from her mother and so on back many generations. Some call it folk medicine, but results speak for themselves." Harold, drifting towards sleep under the influence of a mild sedative Elena had prepared, muttered something that sounded surprisingly like "thank you" before his eyes closed completely. Thomas felt a swell of pride as he watched his wife instruct the town doctor with such quiet confidence. This woman, who had arrived with nothing but a small trunk and determination, had just likely saved his uncle's life using knowledge from a homeland that most in Pine Valley dismissed as backward and foreign. As dawn approached, Dr. Carter prepared to leave, promising to return later that day. "Your wife has remarkable skills," he told Thomas privately as they stood on the porch. "If Harold recovers, and I believe he might, it will be thanks to her." Martha insisted that Thomas and Elena rest before attempting the ride home. She prepared a guest room, bringing hot water and fresh towels for them to wash away the night's strain. Alone for the first time since arriving, Thomas pulled Elena into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. "You were amazing," he murmured into her hair. "I've never seen anything like it." Elena allowed herself to relax against him, the composed healer giving way to an exhausted woman. "Was necessary," she said simply. "He is important to you." Thomas tilted her face up to his, studying the determined features that had become so dear to him. "You did it for me? Despite how he's treated you?" "Did it for him too," Elena admitted. "No one deserves to suffer if help is possible. Even difficult old men who call me the Russian instead of my name." Thomas laughed softly, marveling at the woman he had married. "Elena Sokolov Mitchell, you continue to surprise me." A small smile curved her lips. "Good. Husband should not become too comfortable, yes?" Even in exhaustion, her dry humor surfaced, another facet of this complex woman he was still discovering. Thomas pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Rest now. You've earned it." The days that followed established a new routine. Elena moved temporarily into Harold's ranch house to oversee his treatment, with Thomas dividing his time between caring for both ranches and helping with his uncle's recovery. The arrangement was practical, allowing Elena to administer the frequent poultices and exercises Harold's condition required. To everyone's surprise, Harold proved to be a relatively cooperative patient, at least by his standards. He grumbled constantly, but followed Elena's instructions, pushing through painful exercises with the same stubborn determination he applied to everything in life. His initial distrust gradually gave way to grudging respect as the treatment began to show results. Word of Elena's medical skills spread quickly through Pine Valley. Dr. Carter became a regular visitor, observing her techniques and learning about the herbs she used. He brought his medical books, comparing notes with Elena's knowledge in exchanges that benefited them both. Elena's practical experience complemented his formal training, while his scientific understanding enhanced her traditional remedies. Even more surprising was the change in the town's perception of the foreign bride. Martha Wilson began bringing friends to meet the woman who was saving Harold Mitchell's life with mysterious Russian healing arts. Abigail Peterson, always attuned to shifting social winds, arrived with a cake and obvious curiosity about the treatment that had the whole town talking. Elena handled the attention with characteristic composure, neither seeking approval nor showing resentment for their previous coldness. She answered questions directly, demonstrated simple herbal preparations when asked, but maintained a dignity that commanded respect. "You're becoming quite popular," Thomas observed one evening as they sat on Harold's porch, taking a rare moment of rest together. "Soon they'll be asking you to teach a class on Russian medicine at the church social." Elena smiled slightly, leaning against the porch railing. "People fear what they do not understand. Now they see my foreign ways have value, so they fear less." "Is that all it takes?" Thomas asked. "Being useful is good beginning," Elena replied. "Respect starts with usefulness, perhaps grows into acceptance." She glanced at him, her amber eyes thoughtful in the fading light. "Was same with us, yes. First I was useful wife for ranch, then I saw you," Thomas finished softly. "Really saw you." 2 weeks into Harold's treatment, Elena began the more intensive rehabilitation exercises. Thomas arrived one morning to find his uncle sitting up in bed for the first time. Elena supporting his back while guiding him through careful movements designed to strengthen without disturbing the healing hip. "Look who's decided to join us," Harold grumbled when Thomas entered, though without real rancor. "Your wife is a taskmaster, boy, worse than any trail boss I ever knew." Elena's expression remained serene. 5 more movements, then rest, she instructed, ignoring the complaint. Tomorrow we try standing with support. Harold complied with only token protest, his progress evident in the increased mobility and decreased pain medication he required. When Elena left to prepare a fresh poultice, Harold gestured for Thomas to sit. "That woman of yours," he said, his voice lower than usual. "She's something else." Thomas nodded, sensing this might be as close to a genuine conversation about Elena as they would ever have. "She is." Harold considered his next words carefully, a rarity for a man who usually spoke his mind without filter. "When I arranged that mail-order bride business, I thought we'd get some meek foreign girl who'd do as she was told and give you sons for the ranch. Never expected." He gestured vaguely, encompassing Elena's many qualities that defied his expectations. "Neither did I," Thomas admitted, "but I'm grateful every day for who she is, not who we thought she'd be." Harold's weathered face softened slightly. "She says I'll be on a horse again by spring. Doctor thought I'd never walk without a cane if I lived at all." "Elena doesn't make promises she can't keep," Thomas said confidently. Harold nodded, then fixed Thomas with a shrewd look. "You love her, not just duty anymore." It wasn't a question, but Thomas answered anyway. "Yes, more than I thought possible." "And her? Russians aren't known for wearing their hearts on their sleeves." Thomas thought about Elena's reserved nature, the careful way she approached emotions. "She shows it in her own way, in what she does, more than what she says." Harold seemed to accept this, leaning back against his pillows with a thoughtful expression. "Well, she's earned her place here, foreign or not. Anyone gives her trouble in town, you let me know. Mitchell name still means something in this valley." Coming from Harold, this was tantamount to a formal acceptance into the family. Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't fully acknowledged was there. The strain of being caught between his growing love for Elena and his lifelong loyalty to his uncle. "Thank you," he said simply. "That would mean a lot to her." "Don't go getting sentimental," Harold grumbled, his gruff persona reasserting itself. "Just stating facts. The woman knows her business, save my hide. Credit where it's due." When Elena returned with the fresh poultice, Harold submitted to the treatment with minimal complaint, even engaging her in a detailed discussion about spring planting that acknowledged her agricultural knowledge without condescension. Thomas watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction, seeing the subtle shift in his uncle's attitude, from tolerating the Russian to genuinely consulting with Elena. As Harold's strength grew, he began insisting on hearing ranch reports, making decisions from his sickbed with characteristic authority. Elena allowed this increased activity, recognizing that mental engagement was as important to recovery as physical therapy. She arranged for Harold to be moved downstairs to a makeshift office where he could see the ranch operations through the window and receive regular visits from the foreman. By late February, Harold was taking supervised walks around the house, leaning on a specially designed cane that Elena had commissioned from the town carpenter. His progress had far exceeded Dr. Carter's initial expectations, a fact the physician acknowledged with professional admiration. "Whatever you're doing, Mrs. Mitchell, keep it up," he told Elena during one of his visits. "I've never seen a man his age recover so well from such injuries." Elena accepted the compliment with her usual composure. "He is strong man with reason to heal. Medicine helps, but will to recover matters most." The evening conversations between Thomas and Elena grew longer and deeper as winter gradually loosened its grip on Pine Valley. They would sit on the porch of Harold's house after the old man had retired for the night, discussing the future. They were beginning to envision together plans for expanding their own ranch, for combining Elena's horse breeding knowledge with Thomas's cattle experience, for building a bigger cabin with room perhaps for children someday. "I have been thinking," Elena said one such evening, her voice careful as it always was when approaching an important subject. "When Harold is fully recovered, perhaps I could start small business, herbal remedies, midwife services." Thomas considered the idea, watching how Elena's hands smoothed her skirt, a small tell that revealed the importance of this proposal to her. "You'd be good at it," he said honestly. "Dr. Carter already sends people to you for advice." "Would bring extra income," Elena continued practically, "and would use knowledge I bring from Russia, make it valuable here, not just foreign strangeness." Thomas reached for her hand, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. "Your knowledge has always been valuable, Elena, but I think it's a fine idea. The town could use someone with your skills." She smiled then, a full, warm expression that still came rarely enough to take his breath away. "I want to build something. Here," she explained, "something that is mine, ours, but also honors where I come from." "Then we'll make it happen," Thomas promised. Together, the spring thaw arrived in March, turning snow to mud and revealing the first tentative green shoots beneath winter's blanket. Harold progressed to short walks outdoors, leaning less heavily on his cane with each passing day. His recovery was the talk of Pine Valley, with many attributing it to Elena's Russian magic, a characterization that amused her privately. "No magic," she explained patiently to Martha Wilson as they worked together in Harold's kitchen. "Just knowledge passed, through generations, observation of what works, what doesn't." Well, it's miraculous all the same," Martha insisted. "Everyone's talking about it. Even Reverend Miller mentioned your healing skills in his sermon last Sunday. Said it was a reminder that God's wisdom comes through many vessels." Elena raised an eyebrow at this theological endorsement. "Reverend is kind, but I think some still prefer their medicine without Russian accent." Martha waved away this concern. "Abigail Peterson was asking if you'd show her how to make that salve for joint pain. Her mother suffers something terrible with her knees in damp weather." This was perhaps the most surprising development, that Abigail, who had been most vocal in her suspicion of the foreign bride, now sought Elena's expertise. The transformation reflected a broader shift in how Pine Valley viewed Elena Mitchell. No longer just Thomas's mail-order bride, she had established an identity in her own right, the skilled healer with strange but effective methods, the woman who had saved Harold Mitchell when conventional medicine offered little hope. As Elena and Thomas prepared to return to their own cabin, Harold insisted on a proper send-off. He arranged for a dinner with the ranch hands, Dr. Carter, Reverend Miller, and several other prominent citizens of Pine Valley. It was as close to a formal acknowledgement of Elena's contribution as the proud old man could manage. "My nephew chose better than he knew," Harold announced gruffly during the meal, raising his glass in Elena's direction. "To Mrs. Mitchell, the finest horsewoman and healer in Montana Territory, foreign accent and all." The toast was met with enthusiastic agreement from the assembled guests. Elena accepted the tribute with characteristic dignity, though Thomas noticed a faint flush of pleasure on her cheeks. For someone who had arrived expecting at best tolerance, this genuine appreciation clearly touched her deeply. Later that evening, as they prepared to leave, Harold beckoned Elena to his side for a private word. Thomas watched from a distance as his uncle pressed something into Elena's hand, a small wooden box that Thomas recognized with surprise. It had belonged to his grandmother, a family heirloom that Harold had always guarded jealously. Elena rejoined Thomas with the box held carefully in her hands. "He gave me this," she said, her voice reflecting her astonishment. "Said it should stay in family, and I am family now." Thomas recognized the significance of the gesture. Harold Mitchell, who had arranged a mail-order marriage for the sake of practicality and continuation of the Mitchell name, had just acknowledged Elena not as a necessity or a convenience, but as a valued member of the family, They rode home in the gentle spring twilight, the land around them awakening from winter's sleep. Their cabin waited on the hillside, smoke curling from the chimney where Patrick had lit a fire to welcome them home. "Strange," Elena remarked as they approached. "I came to this country thinking only of safety, of survival. Now I return home, feeling." "Feeling what?" Thomas prompted when she hesitated. "Belonging," she said simply. "Not just to you, but to this place, to myself." Thomas understood. In finding her place in Pine Valley, Elena had reclaimed something that the revolution in her homeland had taken from her. Not just security, but identity, purpose, community. As they dismounted in front of their cabin, Thomas took Elena's hand, drawing her close in the gathering dusk. "Welcome home, Elena Mitchell." She smiled up at him, her amber eyes reflecting the last light of sunset. "Home," she agreed softly. "From Russia to Montana, long journey to find where I belong." Thomas brushed a strand of hair from her face, marveling still at the twist of fate that had brought this extraordinary woman into his life. "I'm glad you found it here, with me." Elena's response was to rise on tiptoe and kiss him, a gesture that had become more natural between them, but still held a certain precious quality, as if each affection freely given was a gift to be treasured. Inside, the cabin welcomed them, with familiar comforts, the books on the shelves, now intermingled Russian and English titles, the embroidered cloths that brightened simple furniture, the herbs hanging to dry from the kitchen beams. What had once been Thomas's bachelor quarters had transformed into their shared home, bearing the imprint of both their personalities. Elena moved through the rooms with a proprietary satisfaction, running her hands along surfaces as if greeting. "Old friends, good to be back," she said, unpacking the small bag of essentials they had taken to Harold's. "Much work to do for spring." "It can wait until tomorrow," Thomas suggested, coming to stand behind her. "Tonight is just for us." Elena turned in his arms, her practical nature momentarily yielding to sentiment. "Yes," she agreed softly. "Tonight, just us." Outside, the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the Montana sky. Inside, a man and woman who had begun as strangers bound by contract found themselves united by something far stronger. Respect that had blossomed into understanding, understanding that had grown into love. The mail-order bride from Russia and the American rancher had created something neither had expected. A true partnership, a shared life, a home in every sense of the word. And in Pine Valley, where Elena Sokolov Mitchell had once been viewed with suspicion and doubt, a new story was taking shape. One of the foreign bride who brought healing skills from the old world to the new, who saved a prominent citizen when others had given up hope, who carried herself with dignity despite whispers and stares. It was the story of a woman who had proven her worth not by demanding recognition, but by quietly, consistently demonstrating her value to her husband, to her reluctant family, and ultimately to the community that had been so quick to judge her. The next morning dawned clear and warm, a perfect spring day in Montana. Thomas woke to find Elena already dressed, her sleeves rolled up as she made notes at the table, lists of seeds to plant, repairs needed after the harsh winter, supplies to order from town. "Already working?" he asked, pouring himself coffee from the pot she had prepared. Elena looked up with a small smile. "Spring waits for no one. Much to do if we want good garden, healthy animals." Thomas sat beside her, glancing at her neat handwriting. "I was thinking we might ride into town today. Word is, the general store has fabric from back east. Thought you might want some for new curtains or such." Elena raised an eyebrow, setting down her pencil. "Curtains can wait. Seeds and tools more important." "We can get both," Thomas suggested, "and perhaps visit the bank while we're there. I've been thinking about that business idea of yours, the herbal remedies and midwifery. Might be good to set aside some money specifically for that." Elena's expression softened with surprise and pleasure. "You were serious about this plan?" "Of course," Thomas replied, covering her hand with his. "Your skills are valuable, Elena. The whole town knows it now." She studied his face for a moment, then nodded decisively. "Then yes, we go to town, seeds, tools, fabric, and bank." Her practical nature reasserted itself immediately. "But first, chickens need feeding." Thomas laughed, rising to help with the morning chores. "Always the practical one. One of us must be," Elena teased, a playful note that had emerged more frequently as she grew comfortable in their relationship. As they worked together in the bright morning sunshine, Thomas found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here, from reluctant arrangement to genuine partnership, from strangers to lovers, from mail-order bride and dutiful nephew to a couple building a future on their own terms. The foreign bride had indeed found her place, not by abandoning who she was, but by bringing her true self, her knowledge, her strength, her dignity, to a new land. And Thomas Mitchell, who had expected only to fulfill a family obligation, had found something far more precious, a partner who challenged him, complimented him, and loved him, not despite their differences, but because of the strength those differences created when combined. In Pine Valley, Montana Territory, spring brought new beginnings. And for the Mitchells, a future neither could have imagined when Elena Sokolov first stepped off the train into a world of whispers and doubt. Together, they faced that future with confidence, knowing that what had started as an arrangement had become a true marriage, founded on the most solid foundation of all: mutual respect, growing into enduring love. The summer sun beat down on Pine Valley, transforming the landscape into a shimmering tapestry of gold and green. 1 year had passed since Elena Sokolov had stepped off the train into a world of uncertainty and judgment. Now, as she stood on the porch of the expanded cabin she shared with Thomas, her gaze swept over the changes that year had brought. The garden she had planted in spring now flourished with vegetables and herbs, many brought from seeds she had carefully transported from Russia. Behind the main house stood a new structure, a small, neat building with windows designed to catch the morning light. A hand-painted sign hung beside the door: Mitchell Healing Arts, Herbal Remedies and Midwifery. Elena's small business had grown faster than anyone anticipated. What began as occasional requests for Harold's joint liniment had expanded into a steady stream of patients seeking help for various ailments. Dr. Carter had become her most enthusiastic supporter, referring cases he believed would benefit from her alternative treatments, and sometimes consulting her on his most difficult patients. Inside the healing house, as Elena called it, neat shelves lined the walls, holding labeled jars of dried herbs, tinctures, and salves. An examining table covered with a clean white cloth stood in the center, while a comfortable chair occupied one corner for consultations. Everything was immaculately organized, reflecting Elena's methodical nature. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the path leading up to their property. Thomas returned from town, his horse trotting steadily beneath him. Elena felt the familiar warmth that his presence always brought, a feeling that had deepened and matured over their months together. "Mail came," Thomas called as he dismounted, waving an envelope. "Something from back east." Elena met him halfway, accepting both the letter and the kiss he offered. "From medical college." Thomas nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Heavy envelope. Must be good news. 6 months earlier, at Dr. Carter's urging, Elena had written to a progressive medical college in Pennsylvania that had begun accepting female students. She had included detailed descriptions of her traditional remedies and techniques, along with Dr. Carter's formal endorsement of her skills. The possibility of formal training to complement her traditional knowledge had captured her imagination. They took the letter to the porch swing that Thomas had built for their first anniversary, sitting side by side as Elena carefully broke the seal. Her English reading skills had improved dramatically, but she still moved her lips slightly as she absorbed the contents. "They accept me," she said finally, looking up at Thomas with wonder in her amber eyes. "For special program in botanical medicine. 3 months in Philadelphia, starting September." Thomas squeezed her hand, pride evident in his expression. "I knew they would. Dr. Carter said your documentation of the treatments for Harold was the most thorough he'd ever seen." Elena stared at the letter, conflicting emotions playing across her usually composed features. 3 months is long time to be away. The business, the ranch. "Martha has been learning your basic remedies," Thomas reminded her, "and I can manage the ranch. Harold's even offered to send Patrick over to help." The mention of Harold brought a small smile to Elena's lips. The old rancher's change of heart had been perhaps the most surprising development of the past year. After his recovery, Harold had become one of Elena's staunchest defenders in the community. When the town council initially resisted granting her a business license because of her foreign methods, Harold had appeared at the meeting, walking without his cane, to deliver a blistering speech about narrow-mindedness and ingratitude. "Philadelphia is very far," Elena said softly. "Different world from Montana." Thomas studied her face, understanding her unspoken concerns. "You've already traveled across the world alone. This journey would be shorter, with a guaranteed return." "Return to what?" Elena asked, a rare vulnerability showing through her practical exterior. "What if things change while I'm gone?" Thomas reached for her hand, entwining their fingers. "Some things change, some don't. This, us, won't change." Elena leaned against him slightly, drawing strength from his steady presence. "When I came here, I thought only of survival, then of acceptance. Never imagined opportunities like this." "You've earned it," Thomas said simply. "Your knowledge, your work. You've helped so many people here. Now you can learn even more to bring back." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the valley in hues of gold and amber. The ranch spread before them, cattle grazing in the distance, the small herd of horses that Elena had begun breeding with careful selection, the fields that would soon be ready for harvest. "I will go," Elena decided finally. "For 3 months. Learn what they can teach, bring knowledge back to Pine Valley." Thomas smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I'll miss you every day, but I'm proud of you." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their moment. Harold's buggy appeared on the path, the old rancher driving with a confidence that belied his close call the previous winter. Beside him sat Martha Wilson, carrying what appeared to be a large basket. "Company for dinner," Thomas observed. "Did you invite them?" Elena shook her head, tucking the letter into her pocket as she stood to greet their visitors. "Must be Martha's idea. She mentioned bringing new preserves to try." The impromptu dinner gathered around the large table Thomas had built to accommodate their increasingly frequent guests. Harold, though still occasionally gruff, demonstrated his changed attitude in subtle ways, asking Elena's opinion on ranch matters, bringing her unusual plants he found during his rides for her to identify, showing genuine interest in her healing work. "So what's this? I hear about some fancy medical school back east," Harold asked bluntly as they finished the meal. "Doc Carter was talking about it in town." Elena glanced at Thomas before answering. "I received acceptance today. Special program. In the botanical medicine. 3-month study in Philadelphia." Martha clapped her hands in delight. "Oh, how wonderful! What an opportunity!" Harold's reaction was more measured, his weathered face thoughtful. "Philadelphia's a long way. Lot of folks around here have come to depend on your remedies." "I know," Elena acknowledged. but knowledge I bring back will help many more. Harold nodded slowly. Makes sense. Mitchell women have always been smart. As whips, my sister, Thomas's mother, would have done something similar if she'd had the chance. The casual inclusion of Elena in Mitchell women wasn't lost on anyone at the table. Thomas saw his wife's eyes soften at the implicit acceptance, the recognition that she had truly become part of the family and community. "We'll miss you. Something fierce," Martha said, already practical. "But I've been taking notes on your basic remedies. Between me and the doctor, we'll muddle through till you return." The conversation turned to logistics, travel arrangements, accommodations in Philadelphia, which remedies to prepare in advance for Martha to distribute in Elena's absence. Through it all, Thomas watched his wife with quiet pride. The reserved, practical woman who had arrived in Pine Valley as a mail-order bride had blossomed into a respected healer, a valued community member, and a pioneer in her own right. Later, after their guests had departed and night had fallen over the valley, Thomas found Elena in her garden, harvesting herbs by lantern light. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. Elena straightened, a bundle of lavender in her hands. Much to prepare before Philadelphia. Lists to make, plants to harvest, instructions for Martha. Thomas smiled at her methodical approach to even this exciting new chapter. "You have 6 weeks before departure, plenty of time." "Must be organized," Elena insisted. "People depend on remedies, cannot leave them without proper care." Thomas took the lavender from her hands, setting it carefully in her gathering basket before taking her hands in his. "Everyone will be fine. You've taught Martha well, and you'll prepare everything needed before you go." Elena sighed, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "I never thought to have such responsibility. In Russia was always daughter following father's instructions. Here people look to me for answers, for help." "Because you've proven yourself," Thomas said simply, "not just to me or to Harold, but to everyone in Pine Valley." Elena looked up at the star-filled Montana sky, then back to Thomas. "When I first arrived, many called me the foreign bride, or the Russian. Now they ask for Mrs. Mitchell the healer. This is strange transformation." "Not so strange," Thomas disagreed gently. "They just needed time to see what I've come to know, that where you're from matters less than who you are." Elena reached up to touch his face, a gesture of affection that had become natural between them. "And who am I, Thomas Mitchell? Sometimes I still wonder." "You're Elena Sokolov Mitchell," he answered without hesitation. "Healer, horse breeder, rancher's wife, Russian by birth, Montanan by choice, and," he added softly, "the best decision I never thought I was making when I agreed to Harold's arrangement." The truth of his words settled around them in the quiet garden. The mail-order bride, once viewed as a foreign oddity at best and an unwelcome intruder at worst, had transformed Pine Valley as much as it had transformed her. Her remedies eased the community's physical pains. Her quiet dignity had challenged their prejudices. Her determination had earned their respect. The weeks before Elena's departure passed in a flurry of activity. She worked tirelessly to prepare her remedies, carefully labeling each jar with detailed instructions for Martha. Dr. Carter visited often, consulting on which patients would need particular attention in her absence. Even Abigail Peterson, once her most vocal critic, now brought elderberries from her garden for Elena's cough syrup, declaring that no one makes it quite like Mrs. Mitchell. Thomas observed it all with a mixture of pride and impending loneliness. The thought of 3 months without Elena made the cabin seem emptier already. Yet he knew this opportunity was too important to miss, not just for Elena's personal growth, but for all those who would benefit from the knowledge she would bring back. The night before her departure, they sat on their porch swing, watching the sunset paint the valley in fiery hues. Elena leaned against Thomas's shoulder, her usual composure softened by the weight of tomorrow's goodbye. "When I stepped off train last year," she said softly, "I never imagined this life, thought only of safety, of roof over my head, never dreamed of respect, of purpose." She paused, turning to meet his eyes. "Of love." Thomas tightened his arm around her shoulders. "When Harold told me he'd arranged a mail-order bride, I thought only of duty to family name. Never imagined finding a partner, a friend." He smiled. "Someone who would challenge me to be better man." "We have built good life," Elena said, her practical nature asserting itself even in this emotional moment. "We'll continue building when I return." "A better life than either of us imagined," Thomas agreed, "because we built it together." As darkness fell and stars emerged above Pine Valley, the couple remained on their porch, savoring these last hours before separation. The foreign bride and the reluctant groom had found in each other not just acceptance, but appreciation, not just companionship, but completion. Whatever challenges the coming months might bring, the foundation they had built would stand firm, a testament to the truth that sometimes life's most precious gifts come in packages we never expected to welcome. The next morning, as they prepared to leave for the train station, a commotion in the yard drew them outside. There stood Harold's buggy, but behind it stretched a line of wagons and riders. Martha Wilson, Dr. Carter, Reverend Miller, Sheriff Dawson, and at least 20 other townspeople. "What's this?" Thomas asked, genuinely puzzled. Harold climbed down from his buggy with the aid of his cane, which he now used more for emphasis than support. "Thought Mrs. Mitchell deserved a proper send-off," he announced gruffly. "Towns coming together to wish her well at the station." Elena stood speechless beside Thomas, her composure momentarily broken by this unexpected show of community support. Martha hurried forward to press a package into her hands. "Travel food," she explained, "and a little something from all of us for your stay in Philadelphia." The small procession made its way to the Willow Creek station, where more townspeople waited on the platform. As the train approached, Elena moved among them, accepting good wishes and promises to follow her instructions for their treatments. She paused longest with Harold, who awkwardly patted her shoulder. "You've done the Mitchell name proud," he said gruffly. "Don't forget to come back to us." "How could I not?" Elena replied, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "This is home now." The final moments belonged to Thomas and Elena alone, standing slightly apart from the others. Words seemed inadequate as the train whistle sounded in the distance. "I will write every week," Elena promised, her hands clasped tightly in his. "And I'll be here when you return," Thomas replied, pulling her into an embrace that disregarded the watching crowd. "Remember, Mrs. Mitchell, this isn't goodbye, it's just until later." As the train pulled into the station, Elena Sokolov Mitchell stood tall on the platform, no longer a foreign bride seeking refuge, but a respected healer embarking on a journey of growth. The townspeople of Pine Valley watched with pride and affection as she boarded, knowing she would return with new knowledge to share. Thomas Mitchell stood at the front of the crowd, his heart both heavy and full. The mail-order bride he had once reluctantly agreed to marry had become essential to his happiness, to his very sense of home. But he smiled as he waved, knowing that what they had built together was strong enough to span any distance, to weather any separation. For Elena had found her worth, not in others' approval, but in her own capabilities, her own contributions, her own choices. And Pine Valley had learned that sometimes the most valuable treasures come from the most unexpected sources, wrapped in foreign accents and unusual customs, bringing healing and wisdom from distant shores. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.